Hello, AP Macro, and welcome back. I appreciate you tuning in today, and wherever you are, I hope you are well. My name again is Mr. Matt Romano. I am in Atlanta, Georgia, teach at Marist School, and today we're going to be talking about debt and deficit, government deficits and the national debt, topic 5.4 in your AP Macro curriculum. This is a topic that you hear about it a lot in the news. You hear about just in conversation. You hear about it in the political process, in elections, in campaign material, everything. It's a big topic. We're going to keep it simple for starters. We're going to start about talking about what these terms mean. How do we know what a deficit is? How is a debt different? How is a surplus obviously different? And then look at how we can apply that in the context of AP Macro, how we can apply it in the context of the world around us, the real world around us, and then talk a little bit about the consequences of debt and deficit over time. We're not going to go too far into that. That's going to bleed into tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be an extension of that, where you get a little bit more specific into what those consequences may be and how that may affect things in the long run. Today, it's more about just definitional. What is a deficit? What is a debt? How do we illustrate this kind of stuff? How do we determine outcomes and make conclusions about economic situations based upon this? So that means we're going to talk about budgets. What is a budget? The term budget balance, which oftentimes is misunderstood in economics, we're going to talk about what that means. We're going to connect that back to fiscal policy and see how fiscal policy actions can affect the budget balance, whether they're discretionary or automatic, something we haven't discussed in a while. So we want to bring that back from Unit 3. And then again, as I said, we're going to talk about the consequences in the long run. Why does any of this even matter? And you could go further and say, does it matter? Well, that's where we're going to go with this. Before doing any of that, let's back up a step and let's warm up. Let's warm up by looking at what you finished with in your last video, the video that talked about money growth and inflation, the equation of exchange. So the homework then was question number 2 from 2017. We're going to do parts A, B, and C. We're dealing with an economy in long-run equilibrium. And in this economy, consumers are going to hold less money because they use credit cards more frequently. They're going to purchase goods and services. They're not using as much cash. That's a really important hint in where we're going in this question. So the first part of the question is going to ask you to draw a money market graph. Obviously, that entails drawing a correctly labeled graph, knowing your axes, your curves, everything else, showing equilibrium, which we always do, and then show, there's a verb for you, show the effect of the reduced holdings of money on the equilibrium nominal interest rate in the short run. So we're going to have to show something here. Based on that change, the question continues. Based on that change in interest rates, what's going to happen to the following in the short run? The price of previously issued bonds, price level and real income, and of course we have to explain that. And then finally, C, this is where we bring in the equation of exchange with a constant money supply based on your answer to part B2. Will the velocity of money increase, decrease, or remain the same? Is the change indeterminate. So let's walk through one part at a time and make sure we know what we're doing here. So the first part, we're at equilibrium, long run equilibrium. Consumers wish to hold less money. How do we show this? How do we show the effects of this on a graph of the money market? So the money market, first and foremost, we're going to have nominal interest rates on the y-axis, the quantity of money on the x. We know we have a vertical money supply curve fixed by monetary policy, fixed by the central bank, and we have a downward sloping money demand curve. And what we're going to show here is that there's going to be a decrease in the demand for money. If consumers are choosing to use credit cards instead of cash, they don't need as much. That's going to decrease the demand for cash. One safe way, at least at this level, one safe way to look at demand for money is to think about the demand for liquid money, cash. How much cash do people need? And in this case, if they're opting to use credit instead of cash, it's going to reduce the demand for money. And we're going to show on the y-axis, we're going to show that that's going to cause a decrease in the nominal interest rate. So that's part A. That's how you would earn all the points for part A. For part B, take what you did in part A and take it to the next step. So we have a decrease in interest rates. How does that affect the price of previously issued bonds? It's going to increase them. And the way this question is stated, that's all you had to put, increase. An up arrow would do. Why is that? Now, you don't have to explain why, but why is that? One thing you need to know, you need to leave AP Macroeconomics knowing, is that there's an inverse relationship between interest rates, a change in interest rates, and the price of previously issued bonds. Those bonds that are already out there that someone already owns and might be buying or selling on the secondary market, on the open market. a quick reasoning for that, just so you better understand. Look at this situation. Let's just say you owned a bond that pays, say, 3%. All right. That means that's a fixed interest rate. You're going to get 3% return on that bond. So all you have to do is hold on to it, and you're going to get paid 3% on that bond. If interest rates fall, as we're showing in this example, that means that new interest rates are going to be paying less than 3%. So let's say that they're only paying 1%. So you ask yourself, if you're buying on the open market, would you rather have a bond that pays 3% or 1%? Well, the previously issued bond paying 3% is going to get you a better return. Demand for those previously issued bonds goes up, and we see the price go up as well. That's why the inverse relationship exists. Do you need to say all that in this answer? No, you don't. All you have to do is say increase. That does it. That answers the question, and you can move on to part 2. Okay, so part 2, what's going to happen to price level and real income as a result of this change in interest rates? And then we have to explain it. Price level and real income will both increase. Why? You have to explain why. The decrease in interest rates will increase interest-sensitive spending. That could be consumption, that could be investment, that could be net exports. We don't know which one, but it's going to increase one or all of these, which is going to cause aggregate demand to increase. And as aggregate demand increases, we see price level increase, we see real income increase. One sticking point, and this is in the chief reader notes to this question, I think some confusion came from students in misunderstanding real income and knowing that real income is essentially synonymous with GDP, real output, which we see on the y-axis, I'm sorry, the x-axis of your ADAS model. Okay, so that's the conclusion we have to make. Again, this is an example that we often see of connecting models and connecting concepts and being able to do that when you answer these types of FRQs. All right, so all that said, we can move on to part C, and we need to have this in mind as we move on to part C because it's going to reference part B too. With a constant money supply, based on your answer to part B2, will the velocity of money increase, decrease, or remain the same, or is the change indeterminate? So again, I've got to connect concepts here. And as soon as I see money supply and probably more importantly, velocity of money, I should know, oh, this is equation of exchange. Where else do I see velocity of money? I only really see it in the equation of exchange. The correct answer is the velocity of money will increase. That's all you have to say. But let's talk about why that is. Here's your equation of exchange. MV equals PY. You can put PQ, same thing. And what are we told? We're told that money supply is constant. So the over bar, that means constant. It's not changing. Money supply is constant. Go back to B2, and we already said price level is going to go up and real output is going to go up. Real income is going to go up. Well, if that's true, and we know this identity is always true, there's only one option for V. It has to go up. Velocity must increase. So again, we've got to be able to use this identity, use this model, and put it into different contexts and be able to answer questions about it. So that's that. That's the FRQ from last time. Let's move on. Let's move on to some review. So those two concepts I just want to bring back to mind that maybe you haven't thought about in a while before we get into deficits and debt. And the first of those two concepts would be automatic fiscal policy. So surely at this point, back in Unit 3, you already discussed fiscal policy and made a distinction between discretionary and automatic fiscal policy. Discretionary we talk about all the time. That's the more straightforward one. That's the one we typically hear more about in the news. Congress goes in and they raise or lower tax rates. They raise or lower spending within the budget. That's discretionary fiscal policy. But what about automatic fiscal policy? I want you thinking about it because this is something that's going to impact the budget as we go through time and we see what happens, even without any kind of explicit action by legislators, by policymakers. So automatic fiscal policy would be those counter-cyclical policy actions that don't require new legislation. They're already built into the law. They were laws that were written a time ago. And as the business cycle happens, they will be applied without the need for any legislation. They are applied appropriately. So as a reminder, what are our fiscal policy tools? Spending, taxes, and transfers. So common examples, the two most common examples that we're going to see for automatic fiscal policy consist of your progressive income tax and your unemployment compensation. And again, quick reminder, progressive income tax, what does that mean? A progressive income tax is one where as incomes rise, tax rates rise with them. The marginal income tax rate is going to rise with it. So as individual incomes go up, those taxpayers pay a larger proportion of their income in taxes. Of course, the opposite is also true. If incomes were to fall, tax rates are going to fall as well. That happens automatically. It doesn't require a new law. As for unemployment compensation, hearing a lot about that in the news right now. Unemployment compensation is essentially a social safety net. It's payment, an ability for those people out of work, those people have lost their jobs, to receive payment so that they can continue at least buying essentials, at least paying for essentials at a time when they are out of work and not receiving a regular income. So let's talk about how those adjust along with the business cycle. During a recession, with progressive income tax rates, you're going to see tax rates fall as incomes fall. We know what happens in a recession. Output is declining, probably 2 consecutive quarters or more. And as output's declining, unemployment's going up, people's incomes, disposable incomes are falling. So as income falls with a progressive income tax, we're going to see tax rates fall, and we're going to see a decrease in federal revenue. Keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to that in a couple minutes. That's going to be important when we talk about budgets. On the other side, unemployment compensation, which is a transfer payment, that's going to rise. You have more and more unemployed workers, and as a result, they're going to qualify for unemployment compensation, and you're going to see the amount of transfers going out increasing overall expenditures by government. And that's the balance we're going to be talking about when we talk about the budget balance. During expansion, the opposite's going to occur. During expansion, more people are working, disposable incomes are rising, and you're going to see tax rates rise as a result. That's going to increase federal revenue. At the same time, with less workers unemployed, unemployment compensation is going to fall, less is being paid out, expenditures are going to fall as a result, and we're going to see how that balance plays itself out in the budget. So keep this in mind. We're going to look at this historically and see how this actually does play out. It is a real thing, and it's going to have an impact on the budget balance. One more piece to review, one more graph in this case to review, is the loanable funds market. We're going to use this, and you're going to use it again tomorrow when you go into crowding out. So let's just review the parts of this thing. What exactly is this market? Over the years, had a lot of students get confused with this one for some reason. It's maybe not as straightforward as some other markets we've dealt with. This is a case, and understand where I'm coming from when I say this, that if you just say it slowly, sometimes it defines itself. This is the market for loanable funds. Now think about what that says, the market for loanable funds, funds which are available for lending. And we need to think a little bit about what that means. Where do those funds come from? Well, most people, when they want to borrow money, they're going to go to some sort of a bank. Where does the money from banks come from? Well, immediately, that's essentially, you're talking about excess reserves. That's what's available for loans. But again, where does that come from? It comes from depositors, and even more specifically, savers. When you deposit your money into a savings account, what you're doing is you're telling the bank they can lend it. It becomes part of this loanable funds market. So savers are represented by that supply curve. Who's doing the borrowing? Those are the demanders, and they're going to be represented by that demand curve. So always remind yourself of that whenever you draw this. You draw that supply curve, those are your savers in the economy. Those are the people putting money away, put money into the bank. It's available for lending. It's available for borrowing. Demanding loanable funds, that means we're borrowing from this loanable funds market. It doesn't matter which sector of the economy we're talking about, that's where borrowing comes from. So with that in mind, and again, this is a little foreshadowing, I'm telling you that right now. How do we show the impact of an increase in borrowing, any kind of borrowing? Well, that should be pretty straightforward. We're going to increase the demand for loanable funds, and that's going to result in a higher interest rate, higher quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium. So keep that in mind. We're going to use that a lot today and even more so tomorrow. Okay, let's move on to the topic at hand, the government deficit and debt, and why that matters and what we need to know about it. So let's get into that. And what I'm going to do, this is actually very much a definitional type topic. We have to understand some terminology before we can really get into the numbers, the graphs, and everything else that goes along with it. So before we can really understand deficits and debt, we've got to understand budgets, because that's where they come from. That's the basis of this whole thing. And budgets, the term budget gets misused a whole lot. So what's a budget? A budget is merely a plan. It's a plan of anticipated income and expenses, how much you plan on bringing in versus how much you plan on spending. And ultimately, we look at that plan and look at how it actually plays out in fruition, and then compare income and expenses to determine the actual status or balance of that budget. A government budget balance is the difference between receipts and outlays. Those are the specific terms that we'll use. By government receipts, we mean revenue, which comes primarily through taxes, so tax revenue. Through outlays, we're talking about all expenditures. We're talking about all kinds of government spending and transfers, both of which are going to be considering here. Budgets may be balanced, or they may be running at a deficit or a surplus. And those are the terms we have to get used to reading and we have to get used to using. We don't talk about budgets going up or going down. And I know that in everyday conversation, we may say that, and that's perfectly normal. But in the context of AP Macro, when we talk about the status of a budget, we either say that the budget is balanced, or the budget is running at a deficit, or it's running at a surplus. What do those terms mean? Balanced budget, pretty simple. I don't want to insult your intelligence, but that would mean that income is equal to expenses. Revenue is equal to expenditures. Pretty simple there. A deficit is that situation where expenses are greater than income. Now stop and think about what that means for a minute. It means that there was a certain amount of income that came into this entity. If we're talking about the government, then it's essentially tax revenue that came in. They spent all that. They spent all the revenue that they got, and then they spent some more. Well, how do you do that? And this is going to bring back into mind the loanable funds market and other things. Well, there's two ways. If you're talking about a household in particular, you could have negative savings, take money out of savings, or what's maybe more obvious, especially in this situation, is you can borrow. And that's where deficits come into play, and that's where we're going to look at the effective deficits, both in the short and long run. A surplus is obviously the opposite. That's when you earn a certain amount of income, a certain amount of revenue, and you don't spend all of it. So whatever is earned in excess of expenditures, that's your budget surplus. And again, we're going to talk about all three of these and look at them in the context of a government or a federal budget and a federal budget balance. Moving forward, fiscal policy, both discretionary and automatic fiscal policy will impact that budget balance. And a lot of questions in AP Macro are going to be structured this way, where you're told an initial balance. Maybe you're told that this government has a balanced budget, policy is implemented, what happens next? Those are the types of scenarios we need to be able to respond to. Expansionary fiscal policy tends to lead to deficits. Why is that? Well, let's assume, again, that we start with a balanced budget where spending and revenue are equal. An expansionary fiscal policy is going to increase spending and or decrease taxes, spending up, revenue down. You're going to wind up in a scenario where expenditures are greater than receipts and you have a deficit. A contractionary fiscal policy could lead to a surplus. It's not a guarantee, but it could. It depends on what the starting point of that balanced or that budget would be. If in a purely hypothetical AP Macro context, you were told there's a balanced budget and a contractionary policy is implemented, that means tax rates go up, that means spending goes down, that means the revenue is going to exceed the spending, and you would have a surplus in that case. Now that's hypothetical, but it can happen. That can happen, even though we don't see it a lot in reality, it is possible. Deficits are going to lead to accumulated debt. In other words, deficit on top of deficit on top of deficit results in debt. And the important thing to take from this is that the words deficit and debt are not interchangeable. They do not mean the same thing. They're not synonymous. Deficits are understood to be annual measures. Debt is accumulated. So from one year to the next, governments may run up deficits by spending more than their total revenue. Over time, those deficits add up to accumulated debt. So the national debt of any country, we hear a lot about this in the news, is the accumulated debt of the nation's government. It's adding up all the surpluses and deficits over the course of that nation's history. Currently, in the US, the national debt is somewhere over $23 trillion. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to give you an exact number on that, but right here in 2020, that's about where we stand. That's saying that if you add it up, cumulatively, all surpluses and deficits, all budget balances going back to 1790, you're going to get about $23 trillion worth of debt. Key questions, once we understand that definitional component, key questions we want to make sure we can understand and answer. Number one, how do governments do this? How do they borrow to finance deficit spending? I mean, yeah, obviously, if there's a deficit, they're borrowing, but what does that mean? Does the federal government go to a bank and ask for money? Obviously not. They're not going and asking for a loan like we would. So how do they do that? By what mechanism do they borrow? We're going to talk about that in just a second. How do we illustrate the unintended consequences of deficits? Where do we go with this? What kind of graph can we use? Again, we've got to think back and go through an inventory of what we have covered. What markets and graphs have we used that might be able to illustrate this? And this will be a pretty obvious one based on what we've already talked about. And then are there other unintended consequences, things that we haven't thought about that may result because of deficits or year after year after year of high national debt, of a large national debt? Well, for the first question, how do they borrow? I'm not going to go into terribly great detail here, but you do need to know the mechanism that is used. We've talked a lot about securities in AP Macro, especially in Unit 4. We talk about the monetary policy side and the banking side of buying and selling securities in the open market. We have to remind ourselves of where these securities come from in the first place. We've been talking about Treasury securities. So I'm taking this from a US perspective, but most economies are going to work in the same way. Most governments work in the same way. That really every month, as in this country, the Treasury determines that, hey, we need some more money, we're going to spend all that tax revenue, securities are issued from the Treasury Department. And a security is simply an IOU. It's a sheet of paper. Well, it used to be a sheet of paper. Think of it as a sheet of paper that essentially says you're lending your money to government. They're going to pay you back at a later date, and they're going to pay you interest over time. And it's essentially a guaranteed payment over time. That's what securities are. And the way governments borrow money is by issuing those securities. Commercial banks primarily, but also foreign central banks, individuals, whomever, they can buy these securities and know they're going to get that interest payment back from government over time. So that's how government borrows. That question comes up. We're going to see this again later in this talk, actually, today. How do we illustrate unintended consequences of deficits? Well, we do so on the loanable funds market. So bring back that loanable funds market and let's remind ourselves, what are we dealing with here? We've got real interest rates on the y-axis. You've got quantity of loanable funds on the x. You've got savers represented by supply, borrowers represented by demand. So a deficit means that the federal government is borrowing money. So where do we put borrowers? We put borrowers on the demand curve. All right. So if the government's coming into the loanable funds market and government is borrowing money in this loanable funds market, what effect will it have? It's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. And in doing so, we're going to see a rise in interest rates. Interest rates are going to go up. And again, the overall quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium is also going to increase. So what's the unintended consequence? The unintended consequence is the increase in interest rates. If this is the result, let's just say it is, if it's the result of expansionary fiscal policy, or even if it's the result of automatic fiscal policies, the intention was never to raise interest rates. The intention was to stimulate economic activity. It was to get AD moving to the right. It was to boost output and lower unemployment. It was not to raise interest rates. That increase in interest rates can lead to some things that really fiscal policymakers may not want and may in some ways offset the intentions of the fiscal policy in the first place. But I'm not going to go further than that because that's your lesson for tomorrow. I'm going to leave you hanging, and that's where you're going to pick up tomorrow in terms of that unintended consequence. Are there other unintended consequences? Well, yeah, there are. There are going to be trade-offs that result. Simple fact is this is part of, again, the AP macro curriculum. A government must pay interest on its accumulated debt. We know that, thus increasing national debt, increasingly foregoing using those funds for alternative uses. In other words, go back to day one of economics when you were learning about scarcity and trade-offs. In this case, trade-offs are going to have to be made. And if we're going to spend more and more of our budget, if the government is going to spend more of its budget on servicing the debt, on paying increasing interest rates on the debt, something else has got to go. And that's a trade-off that has to take place. And again, we're not going to dive too deep into that, but it's a fact that you need to know that potentially could be the result of high deficits and raising interest rates on that deficit and accumulated debt. Okay. All right, let's move forward. How and where do we see this applied? I think this is a place where it's appropriate to look at the data. So I'm going to look at data in two different ways. I'm going to give you a hypothetical first and just see how we actually calculate this stuff, because that does come up from time to time. How do you calculate deficit and debt? How do you obviously work those numbers together and make connections? And then we're going to look at some realistic data. I picked out one decade where some interesting trends occurred, and we're going to see that we can break that down and understand how that happened. So first and foremost, hypothetically, let's pretend somehow we look at a nation's first 5 years in existence. And what we have in this table would be annual figures, first of all, with receipts and outlays, annual figures representing potential budget figures. Maybe these numbers are in millions. They're much larger than they look right here. And we want to determine, what does that mean in terms of the annual budget balance, and what does that do to the accumulated debt? So maybe in year one, and I'm just going to say these numbers as if they were in, like I said, in millions, receipts were $100 billion, outlays were also $100 billion. Well, that means they brought in revenue of $100 billion, they spent that $100 billion, and that was it. Well, then they have a balanced budget. The budget balance is zero, national debt is zero. Move on to year two, and you see that receipts, tax revenue went up by 10 billion. Outlays, though, went up by 15. Who knows why? Something may have happened that made them have to increase their spending more. And as a result, outlays exceed receipts by $5 billion. And now you have a national debt in the amount of that deficit because you started with zero debt. You add that deficit to the following year. The next year, receipts go up another 5, but outlays go up 10. And as a result, the deficit bounces up to $10 billion. That deficit, again, is going to accumulate, add on top of the previous year's debt, and your debt's now at $15 billion. If the next year receipts go up to 120, but outlays are constant, they stay at 125, well, then a deficit comes back down. And we hear this sometimes. You'll hear this in political campaigns. We're going to bring the deficit down. There's still a deficit, which is still going to add to the national debt. And again, that's an important point to keep in mind. Even when you shrink the deficit, you still have a deficit. You're still borrowing money, and the national debt continues to rise. It's not until year 5 where we see receipts exceeding outlays and a surplus exists that the national debt actually starts to fall. So again, understanding the relationship between receipts, outlays, budget balance, and the debt is going to be important for you to understand these concepts and how they relate. And then we need to tie that all together to business cycle data, ADAS, and everything else, and see how they all connect in the big picture. So just briefly, I want to show you how this looks in reality, to some degree, how it looks in reality, and how we can connect trends in these numbers to trends in the overall business cycle. I want to make sure you understand, disclaimer here, you don't have to know the actual data for the AP macro exam. You're not going to be asked about the numbers from any specific point in history, but knowing those trends is important, and seeing those trends in reality can be helpful. So here's actual budget data, and I chose the 1990s because it's a relatively unique period, especially in recent history, where we go from early 90s and relatively high deficits coming off of a recession into late 90s and a surplus. And in this country, we have not had a lot of surpluses since, say, the 1960s. Only about 5 years of surpluses have actually existed. Here are 4 of those 5 years, and it's worth looking at how this country, how the US got there. So if you go all the way back to 1992, in 92, we're coming off of a relatively brief recession, about an 8-month recession in 1991. And you have a deficit of $290 billion because outlays were almost 1.4, whereas receipts were just over $1 trillion. But as you look, this was apparently concerning to a lot of policymakers, and policies were introduced and then enforced throughout the 1990s that really curbed spending and controlled the growth in spending. It didn't stop spending. It didn't stop spending from increasing, but it did control the growth in spending, while at the same time, a growing economy led to increases in tax revenue. So what you're seeing here really is a combination. You're seeing a lot of those automatic stabilizers at play. As the economy grew, and we know that by the late 90s, the economy was very strong in this country. As the economy grew and incomes rose, tax revenues rose with them, not because necessarily tax rates were increased. They were early on here, but not in the late 90s, but because output was growing so fast, incomes were rising, tax revenue went up as a result of that. While in the by the same token, outlays were not growing very fast. There were some policies put in place to keep that from happening. And that gap between the two that we're going to visualize in just a second, that gap between the two shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until in 1998, receipts passed outlays and you wound up with a surplus. Another way to look at that, this is a table from Fred St. Louis. I hope you're familiar with Fred. If you're not, this is a resource you're going to want to know anytime you're keeping up with or curious about economic data. This is from the Federal Reserve Economic Database at the St. Louis Fed. This table shows us in the blue line, government expenditures, and the red line, receipts, that same period we were just looking at. And if you'll look, obviously right here, we see the blue line, expenditures, is far higher than the red line, receipts. But as time goes on and tax receipts rise faster than spending, that gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So what does that mean? That means that the deficit is shrinking, which is exactly what we saw right here. We reach a point in 1998 where tax revenue passes spending, and now that red line, tax receipts, is greater than the blue line, expenditures, and that gap indicates we now have a surplus. That exists until what? Well, this gray line, if you're not familiar with bar notation, the gray line means we're in a recession again. 2001 was a recession. And predictably, in a recession, what's going to happen to tax revenue? It's going to fall. Tax rates are going to fall, not because they were cut necessarily, they were, but not only because of that, but because individuals are earning less income, they're losing their jobs at the same time. Unemployment compensation's going up, and we go back into a deficit. We've been in deficits ever since then. Related to that is total public debt, the federal debt. So this is federal debt for roughly the same time period. And it has been rising for most of that period, but you'll see right here, as a result of the surpluses that we had for 4 years, you do have a short period of time where that federal debt is actually falling. That's the result of surpluses. And then once we go back into deficits, we start to see an increasing federal debt. Again, disclaimer, you don't have to know those actual figures, but it's good to see those trends. It's good to see how it actually pertains to reality, so you can contextualize this stuff and make it real. You're going to understand it a whole lot better if you're able to do that. All right, let's do a little practice with this. First of all, what do we need to practice? In other words, what is AP Macro going to test you on? What are they going to assess you on? What do they expect you to know when it comes to deficits and debt? Well, we need to be able to use this skill. We need to be able to determine the outcome of this situation in terms of changes in the economy, changes in policy, and the impact it has on the budget balance. So really 3 things that questions can ask. Number 1, like I just said, determine the effects of policy on the budget balance. Number 2, determine the effects of deficits and surplus on the national debt. We just looked at that as well. And then number 3, identify unintended results of deficits, especially in the long run. We're going to look at questions 1 and 2, these points 1 and 2, using some multiple choice questions from the question bank on AP Classroom. Your teachers have access to these. These are not secured questions. These are out there, so you can access them, and your teachers can access them as well. For number 3, we're going to use our homework FRQ to do that, because it does require a little bit more explanation. So that's going to be your homework tonight, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So first, let's look at these first 2 points, determining the effects of policy, determining the effects of deficit and debt, on the national debt, deficit surplus on the national debt. So first, question 1. When the United States government engages in deficit spending, that spending is primarily financed by, this is a definitional question. It's just a fact, and it's just a fact that you need to know so that you have a better understanding of what deficits are, and in this case, how deficits are financed. So this was something we talked about a little bit earlier today. Does the US government increase the required reserve ratio? Do they borrow from the World Bank, issue new bonds, or do they manipulate the value of the dollar in order to deficit spend? Go ahead and pick A through E, which one you think it is. This is one where, like many multiple choice questions, I recommend that you try to answer it before you look at your options. That's just a little tip for you on these types of test questions. I think that works well so that you know what you're looking for. For this one, should be obvious. Again, we said it just a few minutes ago. How do they finance it? They finance it by issuing new bonds, securities. Those terms are considered interchangeable in AP Macro, even though bonds are a specific type of security. So issuing new bonds is how the US government will finance deficit spending. All right, so that was pretty easy. We should have gotten that one right. Number 2, if the total of government spending plus government transfer payments is less than tax revenues, which of the following must be true? So again, if I'm taking an exam and I have this question, I've got to write some stuff down. I don't want to look at it just in the question, but I want to try to answer this before I look at the 5 options. So they're telling me that expenditures, spending and transfers, is less than revenue. So the government has brought in more money than they're actually spending. What does that mean? What conclusion can I make? If you take it with that approach, it should be a really simple question. Answer is going to be C. There is a surplus. There is a budget surplus. Tax revenue exceeds expenditures. It exceeds outlays. Then the result is a surplus. Again, that's a definitional question right there. The other options really aren't even relevant to that. Question number 3. Assume a country's government has a balanced budget. All right, so at the beginning here, we have revenue equal to expenses. If the economy goes into a recession, what will happen to the government's budget in the short run? Well, this is now, again, application of policy and how that's going to impact the budget balance. But really, we don't know anything about any discretionary policies, and we can't make those assumptions. We don't know that they're going to change tax rates or change spending. So we've got to connect this to automatic policy, automatic fiscal policy, to see what's going to happen to the budget balance. We should know that with a recession, we're going to see a decrease in output. We're going to see a decrease in national income. That should be obvious for us. And from there, we can connect that back to taxes. We can connect that back to spending through the progressive tax system and unemployment compensation. So what do I know for sure? Incomes are falling, tax revenue is falling with it. At the same time, unemployment's going up, unemployment compensation goes up, so we have expenditures going up, we have receipts going down. The budget was balanced, but now we have an imbalance, more spending, less revenue, we're gonna have a deficit. So right off the bat, I know I'm looking for a deficit, get rid of A and B, it cannot be a surplus. Now read through C, D, and E, why is there a deficit? And if you've already thought through the reasoning, it should be pretty obvious to you. There's going to be a deficit because there's an automatic decrease in tax receipts. Those automatic stabilizers are going to kick in, and with incomes falling, tax revenue, tax receipts are going to fall as well. So the answer is E. All right, one more. Let's try one more. The national debt is equal to which of the following? Again, definitional question here. I would remind yourself or even write down what is the national debt before looking at those 5 options. What is it? Well, it's the accumulated deficits over the time of a government's existence, the sum of all deficits and surpluses. So walk your way down A, B, C, D, and E. And again, if you've already put in mind what you know the answer to be in a definitional question like this, it makes this kind of process a whole lot easier. And as you'll find, the answer is going to be D, the sum of all past government budget deficits and surpluses. So add them up and you get the total national debt. So that's just 4 examples, but pretty common examples of how we can see government deficits and debt appear on AP Macro. Debrief and summary time. What did we do today? Well, topic 5.4, we did government deficits and national debt. We defined budget surpluses and deficits. We defined the national debt. We talked about issues involving the burden of the national debt, those unintended consequences. We should be able to apply what we learned to determine the outcome of situations. And of course, as the bottom here says, we address what a budget is, what a budget balance is, how fiscal policy affects the budget, and again, finally, why all this matters. What are the unintended consequences? Finally, I'm going to leave you with a homework assignment, AP exam practice. This question comes from 2008. This was Form B in 2008, question 1, parts A through C. Again, this was a while ago, 12 years ago, so some of the wording is a little bit different. They do make a reference to the upward sloping portion of the SRAS. That's something that we don't really refer to much anymore. We assume that the SRAS is always upward sloping. But that doesn't change anything in terms of how you would answer this question. So we're going to apply it here, and then that's going to walk you right into the topic for tomorrow, which is crowding out. Finally, let me remind you, as we continue with these instructional videos, we know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We are working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, you can reach College Board directly to let them know, cb.org/tech. We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to show what they have learned this year. I want to thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of this, and hope you come back tomorrow. And Ms. Ray Fields is going to take you through crowding out. Everyone have a great day.